You mentioned California prisons. Vice President-elect Harris is a former prosecutor, and Mrs. Harris and President-elect Biden, Mr. Biden, have both troubling records when it comes to criminal justice. Plus, according to a December 12th Washington Post article, Biden's Attorney General search narrows. The main contenders for this position are Senator Doug Jones, former Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates, and Appeals Court Judge Merrick B. Garland. Could you please talk about what the Biden Department of Justice is likely to do?
Yeah, so, I think it is absolutely true that the history and records of President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris leave something to be desired if you're a criminal justice reformer. Both of them really have all kinds of disturbing things in their record. President-elect Biden was leading the charge in the 1980s and 90s for some of the worst federal laws we have that are still on the books. And it's not just the 94 crime bill. There's the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act, other legislation in the 80s that he supported that really hammered people who committed drug offenses with mandatory minimums. So he has a really long track record from his Senate career of supporting the harshest policies we have. And, for her part, Vice President-elect Harris, as Attorney General of California, defended horrific state practices on appeal in California. And although she did some reform work as district attorney in San Francisco, she also had some pretty harsh policies that she pursued there. So I think the question for both of them is, where are they now? And, I think anyone who believes in criminal justice reform, a big core belief is people do change. People aren't the worst thing they've ever done. People learn from mistakes and they evolve. So I believe that is true, not just of people who commit crimes, but of our politicians. I think they evolve and I think they can learn. And so I am open-minded at the possibility that both President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris can evolve in their thinking. And they've said as much. They have said that they have a reform agenda that they want to pursue. So, so I think we can all stay tuned and see. So the first place to look, I think you're right, is the Department of Justice. Who are they going to put in charge of the Department of Justice? Who do they pick for U.S. attorneys around the country? Who's the Deputy Attorney General going to be? Who are they putting on the federal bench, as we discussed? Who's going to be named to the Sentencing Commission? These are kind of key appointments to look at to see where they're headed. So, at the top of that line is the Attorney General. I think they could be pursuing a different strategy than the one that we're seeing they are. You don't have to pick someone who was a former prosecutor to head the Department of Justice. Bill Barr wasn't a prosecutor. Now, granted, I don't think that's worked out well, but I think that's less about him not being a former prosecutor and about his own worldview. But the Biden-Harris team could have been looking at civil rights leaders to head the Department of Justice. They could have been thinking about people like Cheryl Eiffel or Vanita Gupta, and those names weren't on the list. So, so already I'm, I wouldn't say I'm concerned, but maybe a little disappointed that there wasn't a whole lot of out of the box thinking. The list of names that you read are the kinds of names we would see in any Democratic administration of modern times. They don't reflect any signal that there's any big reform afoot. I will say, I think it's politically stupid to pick Merrick Garland, because that would open up a seat on the DC circuit with no guarantee that you can get confirmation of a replacement, given where the Senate may turn out to be. So I think that's too important of a seat to risk, honestly. And Merrick Garland's career before becoming a judge was as a prosecutor's prosecutor. There's really no indication whatsoever of any support for criminal justice reform. And that's true of his record on the bench. I mean, he really is largely a judge who rules for the government. So I see no reason to do that, given the DC Circuit seat issue. And I don't see any signs there that he would be a reformer. He's obviously got amazing integrity and is an honorable person. And I think he would give the country great confidence if he were the one leading an investigation of anyone associated with Trump. And so there's that advantage, but I just don't think that's unique to him and it's not worth the costs. As for Senator Jones and Deputy Attorney General Yates, I think they both have kind of a mixed record. I think that Doug Jones has supported some criminal justice reforms in his time as a senator. And I think that is a positive sign. He was also someone who was a career prosecutor. And so that's always just a question of what does that mean when you had the Department of Justice and you were a career prosecutor? Prosecutors won't like it if you want big reforms. Who do you side with at that moment? And that's the same question for Sally Yates. For her, we do know her record as Deputy Attorney General. And again, it's mixed. She supported some criminal justice reforms. She was a big backer of what the Civil Rights Division was doing in terms of policing reforms, and that's all to the good. But she also opposed many clemency petitions, which we know from a resignation letter that the pardon attorney Deborah Leff wrote. And, we know that during her time as Deputy Attorney General, the Justice Department was in opposition to legislation that would get rid of mandatory minimums. They wanted something far more modest. The Department of Justice, while she was there, resisted changes to forensic science practices that had been suggested by an independent commission. They resisted changes to compassionate release. So there's some things there that worry me. But again, my hope is that, like President Biden and Vice President Harris, that people can change in their thinking. And so I think that Sally Yates is someone who, since she has left her prior position, has indicated an interest in more criminal reform efforts. And my hope is if she's picked, that she doesn't just pick up where she left off, but she recognizes mistakes and shortcomings in her prior stint and tries to remedy them.
But do they have an incentive to do so, considering the political landscape in the United States and considering how President-elect Biden just recently spoke to civil rights leaders, the tone of that leaked audio in the Intercept?
I think it's hard to say what the stronger political incentives are. It's actually a very fine line that he's going to have to walk, because on the one hand, there is not widespread public support for abolishing police or, what they think defund the police means. If it means abolishing or defunding to zero, anything that looks like it's that, I think there'll be political backlash against him. On the other hand, there is political support for taking some of the functions that police currently have and putting it into better, having mental health responders, getting police out of schools. I think there's some support for those kinds of reforms, and there is certainly support for addressing racial discrimination in criminal justice practices. And there's a lot of political pressure among not just the African American community. I think it's broader than that. I think there's a large segment of the populace that is looking to Joe Biden to address those racial injustices. And if that's going to happen, then you do need someone at the head of the Department of Justice that recognizes we need significant reform. And if it doesn't take place, they're going to be watching. All the people who care about those issues will be paying attention. So I think there's political pressures on both sides, but I think there are definitely reforms that would get widespread popular support and that are needed if he's going to keep his promise, particularly to the Black community, that he has their back. Because these incarceration and criminal justice practices have disproportionately fallen on communities of color, on Black men and women. And I think that if he's going to keep his word, he's going to need to do more to remedy that.